Hello from the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, well, I'm having an amazing day. If I'm having an amazing day, you should be having an amazing day as well. Okay, first of all, apologies for not having made a video for so long, I have been very busy these last 2 months, preparing my students for the May exam of the IGCSE. But since May exam is coming to a close, well, I'm freer right now. I won't be free for very long, but free enough to make a couple of videos for you guys. And, I really do like making videos, but as you know, making videos is not my bread and butter, so that's why I can only make them when I have time, and time is a very finite resource in my case. Okay, without further ado, let's get cracking. So I came across this video on YouTube about an African-American comedian who was lamenting that in America he did not feel fully accepted, while at the same time, back in Africa, he didn't feel fully accepted either. Well, he wasn't accepted in America because he wasn't white, and in Africa he wasn't accepted because he was seen as American, right? So basically he felt very frustrated, and although the skit was supposed to be comedy, you could feel the resentment and a feeling of resentment in the man's voice. Take a look.
You know what's fucked up? African people don't like black people. Y'all know they treat us like shit. They talk down to us. They think they better than us. And I don't understand, because we from the same tribe, kind of. But they like white people, though. They treat y'all like family. As soon as y'all come around, they get excited. Excuse me, Mr. White Man. Thank you for bringing us here. We love you. Yeah, the white man. As soon as they see us, they get an attitude. Hey, how you doing? This nigga. We don't like the black man in America. Motherfucker, you don't work, you don't do shit. We don't like you, you black motherfucker. Like, who are you calling black, motherfucker? I'm brown, you midnight. Who the fuck are you calling black? Like, nigga, if you stood up against a building, you'd look like an alley. Who the fuck are you calling black? This shit is unjust. African men don't understand why when they come to America, they have a hard time getting American pussy. You can't be that aggressive with American women, especially black women. You gotta know how to talk, you gotta come correct. Motherfuckers in Africa is used to having their way. They got 15 wives and shit. And African women are very obedient. They tell their women what to do. It's not even an issue. Bitch, when they come home, you... I don't know why they do that. You better clean this shit from the floor. They be in the club stalking women out here. You can't even see them. They be as black as my jacket. You just see the yellow of their eyes from a distance. Looking like Congo in the bush. As soon as you go buy your drink, they jump out the shadows and scare the shit out you. Bitch, what is your name? Come here. Don't run from me. You're going to be my wife. Monaya, Monaya. They're hunters. It's instant.
Now, although this skit was supposed to be a comedy skit, and it was supposed to be tongue-in-cheek, you could sense the hurt and resentment in the man's voice, right? Now, the feeling that my own people apparently don't accept me, because, hey, we're all black, right? Why is it you're treating me the same way the white man treats me in America, right? And as much as I want to feel sympathetic for this man, I can somewhat understand the point of view of the people from Africa in not accepting this man as one of them. Because although biologically they may be of similar genetic coding, ultimately, culturally, they are worlds apart, right? And it's not the African-American man's fault that he's culturally more Anglo-Saxon than the African in Africa. It's not his fault because his ancestors were brought over against their will on slave ships, you know. But it is a self-evident fact that there is about as much in common culturally between this man and people who are culturally African, regardless of which part of Africa they may come from, whether it's Zambia, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, or Algeria, or Libya. Culturally, this man has far more in common with the average white American man than he does with anyone from the region of Africa who was raised in an African culture. And this is a part, or rather this is something that he finds very, very difficult to come to terms with. Because the fact of the matter is that while, yes, in America, due to, you know, white supremacist oppression and anti-blackness and the abuse, the systemic and routine abuse of African American people, the African American diaspora, like the Malaysian Chinese diaspora, you know, has created a sense, rather, of community, right? And a sense that every black person ought to be obligated towards another black person, or rather every black person should be obligated to the so-called black tribe. But that's simply not how it works in Africa, because, you know, the dynamics, the racial dynamics are very, very different in Africa. Because when you go to Africa, you're not seen as a black man. They don't think of themselves as being black. And I have to clarify that I'm not speaking on behalf of people from Africa. But what I am saying is that people from the motherland, whether it's Africa or Asia, they do not regard themselves as the same as people in the American, Australian, or British diaspora. Because culturally, our upbringings have been as different as night and day. And beyond, you know, whatever he's seen on TV, I'm willing to tell you that this man, this comedian, has got, at most, a superficial understanding of African culture. Do not confuse black American culture with the culture of the motherland, because that simply is not the case. It is like saying Asian American culture or General Tso's chicken has anything to do with the culture in Asia itself. But it's problematic using words like Asia or Africa in order to describe such a vast continent, you know, of people of various customs and beliefs and practices. Now, due to white supremacy, of course, Africans from various tribes, you know, who may not have gotten along, whose ancestors may not have gotten along, were basically forced together, right? And forced into an alliance, right? And basically, that's how the black identity was created. Likewise, the Asian American identity, right, is really basically a hodgepodge of various Asian people who in the motherland, who in Asia might not even get along, right? Who have been thrust together as a result of white supremacy, right? But back in Asia, the racial dynamics are not quite the same. So, you know, you can't expect Asians in Asia to basically see every other Asian person as their brethren, right? Simply because our racial dynamics are so different. But I'm going off on a tangent here. Like I said, you know, culturally this man has far more in common with the average white American than he does with the average person from any part of Africa who was raised in an African upbringing, right? Culturally, this man has about as much cultural knowledge of Africa as the average white or Asian American does, right? And judging by the fact that he talked about African men as being, aggressive, sexist, philanderers, proves to you that he still sees the motherland as backward and outdated and barbaric, and he may not realize it, but he still sees himself, an African American, as being more civilized and progressive and enlightened than people from the motherland, right? And the same could be said of certain Asian Americans, whose names I'll not mention, who regard themselves as being superior to people from the motherland. And despite the fact that I have been called whitewashed by a certain few Asian Americans, because I don't speak Chinese, and I have what they term an Anglo accent, the painfully obvious reason why these people who call me whitewashed would not deign to come back to Asia and live, is because they know deep in their hearts that they will not fit in because they are culturally American. That almost sounds like an oxymoron. What is American culture, really? Anyway, the fact of the matter is that I grew up in Asia. I live in Asia. Yeah, I don't speak Chinese because I was raised in a Malay environment, right? I went to a Malay school, so I speak Malay. But apparently Malay is not considered Asian for some of these Asian American activists because, Asian Americans tend to have a rather East Asian-centric kind of worldview. And that's why the model minority trope doesn't... When people think model minority, they're not really thinking about Southeast Asians or South Asians. Well, maybe Indians, but not Southeast Asians, right? Because the American Nazis, whom they rub shoulders with, do not regard Southeast Asians as being on the same genetic level as East Asians. But I digress. The point is that there are some Asian Americans who do speak the language of their ancestors because, their parents pass the language down to them, who regard themselves as, authorities on Asia, because they know the language, they eat the food. But the fact of the matter is, this is going to sound like a stretch, right? But an Asian American who was raised in America is not likely to know more about Asian society in Asia, even if he or she may speak the whatever language their parents spoke. Well, neither of my parents actually speaks Mandarin, Mom speaks Cantonese, Dad speaks Hokkien, which is like a mix of Hokkien and Malay. He's Peranakan. But neither of which was passed down to me, of course, because, if either of them spoke their dialect at home, then nobody would understand anybody, right? So we all spoke English at home, and I wasn't sent to a Chinese school because, the medium of communication is Mandarin, and neither of my parents would be able to help me with my homework, you see, because neither of them speaks Mandarin. So the point is, I am not less Asian than these Asian Americans because I happen not to speak Mandarin. I am not more whitewashed than they are just because I don't speak my purported mother tongue. Yes, although there are some bigots in this country, in Malaysia as well, some of the Chinese ultras who would regard me as a fake Chinese. The fact of the matter is that, even if you were raised in a monolingual English environment in Asia, and you went to an international school since day one, it doesn't mean that you don't know what growing up in an Asian society is like, right? Yeah, I mean, the international school is rather an insular bubble. You know, it's very much a very westernized sort of environment. But an Asian American from America, like this one here, who claims that they know more about Asian culture than an Asian person in Asia, like I do, simply because they speak Mandarin and I don't, is actually deluding themselves. Because the fact that this person did not understand the basic fact that multi-generational family units are the norm in Asia, and this person thinks that only applies to Singaporeans, despite the fact that this person does speak Mandarin, this person does speak Chinese, proves to you that knowing a language and having superficial aspects of a culture such as food and clothing does not make you culturally Asian if you were not raised in an Asian society, right? So that's something that these people, you know, like this man in the video, the comedian, the African American comedian, the people like this need to understand. Culture is a lot deeper than superficial aspects like language, clothing, and food. Culture is lived practices. How many of these Asian Americans who call me whitewash, how many of them live with their parents? How many of them practice the multi-generational family unit? How many of them practice things like Qingming? Or how many of them understand the cultural nuances of Asia like I do? I'm willing to bet that not many of them do. Beyond the fact that they speak an Asian language. I speak an Asian language as well. I speak Malay, although I doubt that these chauvinists, these East Asian chauvinists regard Malay as an Asian language. They probably regard Southeast Asians as like the Mexicans of Asia. Anyway, because you know I have heard some Asian Americans even referring to Southeast Asians as jungle Asians. Anyway, yes, the fact of the matter is that you cannot presume to know more about Asia if you were raised in America and you live in America simply because you happen to speak an Asian language. And you cannot presume to be an authority on Chinese or Korean or Japanese culture just because you speak the language. Just like a person who speaks fluent English cannot presume to be an authority on the English culture, right? You could know jack shit about the English culture despite the fact that you speak English like King George III. Now, here's the thing. You see, here's the thing that you guys need to understand, you in the American diaspora. You are a foreigner, as long as you're not culturally Asian or African. Doesn't matter even if you speak a language from Asia or Africa. If your worldview is Western, you will be treated like a foreigner, right? It's a very simple fact, but it's something that people find very, very difficult to understand. Even those people calling me whitewashed do not understand this basic fact that in Asia, they will be seen as more whitewashed than I am. And that is the obvious reason why they're not moving back to Asia, right? If they hate the West so much, why don't they repatriate to Asia? Because they obviously know that they still fit in better in the West. But at the same time, they're not happy in the West because they feel they don't get the respect they deserve. Just like this African-American comedian. Of course he's not happy because in America, yes, he's treated like a second-class citizen. I can understand that. But in Africa, at the same time, he will have certain attitudes towards local African people, right? Certain attitudes and certain biases and certain prejudices that result from his Anglo-Saxon upbringing, right? And the same could be said about guys like, you know, who are like model minority math nerds in America. Guys like Douglas Kim, for example, who pride themselves on being like model minority math wizards. Yeah, in America they might be that, but in Asia they'll just be seen as, well, an uncouth, loud and abrasive American. That's all, right? Yeah. So that's the great irony of them, people like them calling me whitewashed. I am basically done myself with talking to Asian Americans because I actually have more in common, culturally speaking, with people from a place like Nigeria or Zimbabwe than I do with an Asian American whose genetic makeup is closer to mine. Because culturally, myself and most Asian Americans are as different as night and day, right? So, you know, just because you're of a certain race, you can't assume that everyone of the same race is going to have solidarity with you, right? It is extremely delusional to assume that just because a person is Asian, that the person has an obligation to have solidarity with you. Because frankly, culturally speaking, even the Asian Americans who call me whitewashed are seen, would be seen as culturally American, more so, more culturally Western than me, in fact, by people in Asia, right? And here's the funny thing that I want to, and I also want to bring up in this video, is that there are some, as a result of, you know, oppression by both the British and the Malayan authorities in colonial times. The Malaysian Chinese, much like the African Americans, have created rather insular communities, right? You know, you have African Americans calling people whitewashed for talking white, right? Because they feel that they're betraying their black brethren by talking white, dressing white, acting white. You also see the same phenomenon in Malaysia, among the Malaysian Chinese diaspora, as a result of colonial oppression, right? And so they've created a very, very insular and very, very protectionist kind of community, right? So even Chinese who are not Chinese enough, like who don't speak Chinese or who may talk like a white man, you know, doesn't use a Malaysian Chinese accent, that's a Malaysian Chinese accent. But it's not natural for me because, you know, my grandfather himself spoke with this kind of accent. My grandfather is British educated. So anyway, that's the thing. It's not natural for me, but I myself am seen by a small minority, not the majority of Malaysian Chinese, but a small minority of very, very protectionist Malaysian Chinese as, you know, an imposter in the Chinese community because you know, I don't speak any Chinese and apparently my accent is too Western. So the diaspora has created I mean, you wouldn't see the same kind. I've not observed the same kind of dynamic among people from China or Taiwan. You know, I'm not. Basically, the diaspora, in order to protect itself, has created this sense of identity that revolves around race, right? And so I can't say I fully blame this African American man, this African American comedian for expecting people from Africa to be in solidarity with the black struggle in America, or expecting them to have black solidarity with people, African American people. But the fact of the matter is that it doesn't quite work that way. It's just like there are some Malaysian Chinese whom I personally know who believe that a strong China will result in a safer population, or rather will result in more security for the Chinese diaspora in Malaysia and Indonesia. But I am afraid to say, and with due respect, that I think they are sorely mistaken, because China has its own business to look after. China does not look upon the Malaysian Chinese diaspora as being 中国 or 华夏. You know, what that means is a person from the motherland, you know. Because the fact of the matter is that we have been away for the past 100, 200, if you're Peranakan or Baba Nyonya, 300 to 400 years, 500 even. So, the people in China, by this point, regard you, yes, genetically as a fellow Chinese, but at the same time as a Malaysian, not a Chinese from China. So, naturally, it is normal to expect people to prioritize their own family members first, right? So, naturally, China will prioritize people from China first. China does not have an obligation to the Chinese diaspora, right? Because as far as they are concerned, we've already left the family and joined another family. And I think it's very, very foolish to say that, you know, my heart is in China. I live in Malaysia, but because I'm a second-class citizen here, yeah, even if that's true, to say that my heart is in China, because China does not think of it that way. Just like Asia, or rather Africa, does not think of African Americans as one of them. And they don't look at themselves as black. Or rather, I should say that they don't look at themselves as black in the same way as an African American would look at themselves as black. So, I think the diaspora longing to be accepted by the motherland is a pipe dream, basically. I think that you should do your level best to try and make a life in the country that you currently live in. And I think it's, there are exceptions, unless of course you're Malaysian Chinese and you really want to move back to China, you have to change your entire worldview. And basically, it's not just knowing the language. Your worldview has to shift, and your way of life also has to shift. Because the Malaysian Chinese diaspora, whether they speak Chinese or not, you know, has evolved their own unique subculture, right? I mentioned that the African Americans have their own, they are culturally not really similar to people from Africa, right? I didn't mean that as an insult, because they've created their own subculture, right? Just like the Malaysian Chinese have created their own subculture as well. And, you know, I think it's a pipe dream to expect the diaspora, to expect the so-called motherland to come to your rescue if anything goes wrong. If let's say there are pogroms or there are racial riots in Southeast Asia, I think it's very foolish to expect China to come to your rescue, because you might not be aware of this, but just before 1989, shortly before 1989, the communist leader of Malaysia, Chin Peng, basically was summoned to see Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping told him that, you know, we want to have good relations with the governments of Southeast Asia. We want to have good relations with the Malaysian government. This is the last batch of money we will give you, and no more. And that's partly why the communist revolution, the communist uprising in Malaysia failed, because China, its number one source of funding, decided to cut its funding, because Deng Xiaoping was a pragmatic man. You know, he was not an idealistic man, but a pragmatic man. And Deng Xiaoping did not want to continue financing the communists of Malaysia, because it was pissing off the Malaysian government, and he didn't want to have a hard time doing business in Southeast Asia, and he didn't want to make enemies in Southeast Asia. So he stopped funding the communists of Malaysia, even though most of the communists of Malaysia were Chinese. As a result of colonial oppression and government persecution, of course, you would expect most of the communists to be Chinese. There were Malays like Abdullah Sidi or Rashid Maidin, but the vast majority of them were Chinese, because communism tends to attract people who face oppression, right? People who are downtrodden in society, right? And the Chinese were really the most downtrodden race at one point, right? So in colonial times they were. So the fact of the matter is that even Deng Xiaoping he placed pragmatism over idealism and did not feel the need to support his Chinese brethren in Southeast Asia, because he was fundamentally concerned about taking care of his own family in China first, right? And you can't really blame him, because, as I've said, people want to look after their own first, and you are not seen as the Chinese family. Yeah, you're seen as a good friend probably, but at the same time you're not seen. You will not be Chinese. In the Chinese diaspora is their own unique subculture or subgroup. They may be genetically similar with people from China, but at the same time, they're not one of them, right? So I think this idea, this belief that the motherland will have some kind of obligation towards you is a misguided belief. And I think that rather than putting our hearts in China, or rather I should think that we should try and fix our own country's situation, rather than putting our hearts in China and saying that I am Malaysian second, Chinese first. Then you're really no different from those people like Hishamuddin, those racist Malay politicians. You're no different from them. If you say I'm Malaysian second but Chinese first, fundamentally I am Chinese first. Or if you say that I'm whatever, you know what I mean. So yeah. So I'm just gonna wrap this video up by saying that the diaspora and people from the so-called ancestral land may share a similar hardware, right? But their software is totally different, right? And it's not their fault. It's not the Malaysian Chinese fault either that our culture or our outlook in life and our culture is so quite different from what it would be in China, right? In fact, those who are calling me a disgrace to the Chinese race, a banana, whatever, the irony is that a social chauvinist from China would also call them bananas, because their Mandarin or their Cantonese will never be up to par with what you would get in China, right? So they may call me a banana, but to the social chauvinists in China, we're all bananas, you see. So the same thing goes for African Americans, like who say that, why are you acting white? Why are you dressing white? Why are you so white? A social chauvinist in Africa will all say, you guys are all acting white, in the sense that, who are you to call someone whitewashed? When a social chauvinist in Africa would also call you whitewashed, right? Because you don't speak any African language, and you basically have an American, which translates to Anglo-Saxon outlook in life, right? So maybe remove the plank. The same goes for those Asian Americans calling me whitewashed. A social chauvinist in Asia would call them whitewashed as well, would call them whitewashed, more whitewashed than me actually. Remove the plank out of your own eye before you attempt to remove the speck of dust out of your neighbor's eye. That's what America's favorite Palestinian philosopher said, didn't he? Well, he also said that, sooner will a camel pass through the eye of a needle than will a rich man enter heaven. But I suppose that, the Americans read the Bible selectively. So, yes, that's about it for today, really. Yes, so that's all I want to say. As much as I sympathize with the struggle that African Americans face, or the struggle that Asian Americans face, under the boot heel of white supremacy, at the same time, you're not doing anyone any favors by calling people whitewashed willy-nilly just because they don't fit your mood as to what a real African or a real black or Asian person would be, right? And yeah, the hard truth that you have to swallow is that most of the people who lament about me being whitewashed are themselves culturally Western, right? Thank you.